Turn to 1 Samuel 17 for what is perhaps the most well-known story in the Bible, although I don't know anymore, with Bible knowledge at an all-time low in our country. But I think it's still safe to say most people have heard of David and Goliath. As I said this morning in the bulletin, the most well-known and misunderstood Bible story. So we know the basics of the story. A shepherd boy defeats a mighty giant and warrior of the Philistines simply with a sling and a stone. But it's interesting if you look at 1 Samuel 17, look at how many verses is in this chapter. And tonight's going to be part one. We'll look at the first 30 verses. Look at how many verses are in this chapter. 58 verses. How many verses are devoted to the battle between David and Goliath? Well, if you don't count the trash talk that leads up to the battle, only one verse, and that's verse 41, is devoted to the actual battle between David and Goliath. So I think it's safe to say that that is not the most important thing. Amazingly so. The most important thing about David and Goliath is not the actual battle, which takes place in only one verse. There's many things leading up to the battle that are most important, as we'll see as we consider this together. Now, what do most people think of when they hear the story of David and Goliath? Even many Christians. What's the very first thing that you think of when you hear about this story and how it's applied to our lives today? Facing the giants, okay. You too can defeat the giants in your life. Although there is a kernel of truth in that, as we'll see at the end when we look at the application in great detail. Okay, even the weakest can defeat great warriors. I like to put it this way, small people can do big things. And when I was single, I had an answering machine message, and I think if I remember it correctly, it went something like this. Tall people get all of the respect, but don't forget what happened to Goliath's neck. This is David, leave a message. So yes, I've heard all the short jokes, but don't forget my name is David. All right. Don't be afraid of the giants or the bullies in your life, things like that. What's the problem? The number one problem with a message like that is that there's no redemption in that message. That message has nothing to do with the gospel. And the Bible has everything to do with the gospel. And what, sadly, most Christians don't understand is that the entire Old Testament points to Jesus. He himself said that after his resurrection on the road of Emmaus with two of his disciples. He explained to them in the scriptures everything that concerned him. And so that's the question we have to ask. How does David and Goliath point to redemption through Jesus Christ? Because that's the main point of the story. That's the main point of the entire Old Testament. So I hope to walk us through this so we can see how that's the case. Let's look at the context. Let's start with the context. The Philistines have been Israel's most feared enemies for a long time, ever since the days of the judges. Remember, Samson battled against the Philistines. The Philistines occupied a strip of coastal land on the Mediterranean known as Philistia. They were among the people of the sea people who invaded Syria and Egypt in the 12th century BC. Philistia was a league of 5 important Philistine cities, as we've seen often enough: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. And as we'll see tonight, Goliath was from Gath. The Philistines were among the many Canaanite nations that Israel failed to drive out of the land. Turn with me to Numbers 33. There was consequences for failing to drive out the Canaanites. Numbers 33:55. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. A quick New Testament application, we could put it this way: if you are not killing sin, then sin will be killing you or harassing you. Turn to Joshua chapter 13. Joshua 13, 1 and 2. Now Joshua was old, advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, you are old, advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed. This is the land that yet remains, all the territory of the Philistines and all that of the Geshurites. All of the territory of the Philistines. The children of Israel have never even taken over that territory. They have not driven out the Philistines. Who remembers when the Philistines will finally be driven out of that territory and the entire land will belong to Israel? That doesn't happen until King David. King David will be the one who finally defeats the Philistines once and for all, as we'll see when we get to 2 Samuel. The Philistines have been a thorn in the side of Israel and have been harassing them for a very, very long time. Conflict with the Philistines has been lasting all throughout Saul's reign. Saul has failed as a king and spiritual leader of God's people. Because he was rejected by the Lord, because he rejected God's word, God has rejected him. And in the last chapter, we saw the prophet Samuel secretly anointed Saul's replacement, David from Bethlehem, son of Jesse. So that's the historical context. Now let's ask this question: what is the spiritual meaning of the conflict with the Philistines? So this broad context. Israel is the only nation in the world at the time that is in covenant with the one true God, Yahweh, the Lord. Israel is the only nation that has the Holy Scriptures and the promise of a Messiah. In Genesis 3:15, the Lord said there would be two groups of people descending from Adam and Eve, the godly seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And the Lord promised that from the godly seed in Israel, the Messiah would come to crush the serpent's head and redeem God's people. Israel was the only nation in the world that had the godly seed. Certainly not that everybody in Israel was godly, but Israel had the godly seed of the woman. All other nations belonged to the seed of the serpent. Now, there was a handful of Gentiles that came to faith, but again, the whole world walked in darkness. The only light was in Israel. Do you remember what John the Baptist called the Pharisees when they were coming to him to be baptized? Brood of vipers, seed of the serpent. So as God said from the very beginning, that has lasted all the way until our day. There's only two kinds of people, 1 John 3:10, the children of God and the children of the devil. So guess what? The Philistines were the seed of the serpent attacking Israel. To attack Israel is to attack the Lord's people, to attack the godly seed, and with that the promise of a Messiah. So the serpent himself, we could say, Satan himself, was working through his seed, and he's had his seed in every generation. So the particular seed that he had at this point in history was what? Goliath and the Philistines. And Satan's goal from the moment that Genesis 3:15 was announced Satan's goal has been to destroy the godly seed, to prevent the Messiah from coming. So that's the context of David and Goliath. Let us now consider then the first 11 verses as our first main section. Goliath defies the armies of Israel. Verses 1 through 11. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together in battle and were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. So I'm not a very good artist, but Philistines on one mountain, Saul and the armies of Israel on another mountain. So Goliath's going to be down here. The valley of Elah is about 16 miles long. So I forgot to draw my Goliath here, so we'll just do that. There we go. Somebody can improve this artwork later on if they'd like. I only deal in stick figures. All right. So look what it says in verse 1, and I drew your attention to that. It says, the Philistines were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. So the Philistines were encamped in territory belonging to Judah. And no one said it better than Matthew Henry in this connection. Listen to what Matthew Henry said. Israel's ground would never have been footing for Philistine armies if Israel had been faithful to their God. So remember, Israel is to be driving the Philistines out of the land. But what did they do? They let them remain, and so the Philistines are going to be a thorn in their side, and they're going to attack them and harass them. And so that's what's taking place. And they're after more territory in Israel. Okay, verses 4 through 7, we have a description of Goliath. Verse 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, a cubit is anywhere from 18 to 20 inches. So if we use a 20-inch cubit, 6 times 20 is 120 inches. So how tall is that? 10 feet. So he's definitely over 9 feet. And just a little chart here. So Saul was a head taller than anybody else in Israel. He would be over 6 feet. And then we put David right there, a little over 5 feet. Not quite 6 feet. Like you said, Roger, last week, David was probably about 5'6". Now, I want you to notice something. It says Goliath is from Gath. He's one of the last remaining giants of the Anakim in Gath, who had existed since since Joshua's time. Turn to Joshua 11. Let me show you this. This is a fascinating study. I'd like to do it one day in more depth. The Anakim. You know, George Lucas knew what he was doing by calling, was it Luke Skywalker's father? Anakin. So he knew what he was doing linguistically. Because Anakim means, it's a reference to the giants. So he's a giant of a character, so to speak. Where was I? Joshua 11. What did I say? Joshua 11:22. Sorry, I got sidetracked. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So to their credit, unless the giants just died off on their own, the only giants that were remaining in Saul's day were the ones in Gath. And we find out later that Goliath actually had 5 brothers in Gath. All right, back to 1 Samuel 17. Notice that Goliath is called a champion. Now, the Philistines, according to historical sources, they enjoyed having what we would call a duel among their own warriors to see who was the best. So he would be referred to as the champion warrior. And so that's what we have here, a description of the Philistine champion. Look at verses 5 through 7, a description of his armor. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, about 125 pounds. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. The spearhead alone weighed 15 pounds. That'd be about the weight of a bowling ball. And a shield bearer went before him. That's one thing we forget, that Goliath actually had a man to carry his shield in front of him. So commentators estimate that Goliath must have carried about 200 pounds of armor. He's a walking arsenal and a deadly soldier. As one commentator put it, a giant who used every piece of armor with precision. So he's a walking arsenal and a deadly soldier. All right, so verses 8 through 10, Goliath is going to issue his challenge to Israel. Verses 8 through 10. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now, Goliath knows that he has the advantage. I want you to take note of his disrespect towards Saul. Notice he doesn't even address Saul. Saul basically is totally overlooked here. Look how he refers to Saul indirectly. Verse 8, "Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul?" Saul is the most logical choice to face Goliath. Saul was chosen in the first place because of the fact that he looked like a king. He was a head taller than anybody else in Israel. So Saul is the most logical choice. And you know what? Saul in his armor would look very intimidating, but not to a 9-foot giant, a champion warrior. Okay, so, but Goliath also understands the cost of war. He knows how much bloodshed can come out of a war. And so he's doing what many nations did during that time. This offer of having just a duel between a champion from one side versus a champion from the other side to decide the battle, that was quite common, because both sides would benefit from not losing much life. And so Goliath is also interested in just getting this over with. And so that explains his challenge. As I said, Goliath knows he has the advantage, and he knew he towered over Saul, who was a head taller than anybody else. And he knows that Israel has no one who would dare to fight him. He knows this. And so his challenge is bombastically mocking Israel. Verse 10, "I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now, as we'll see later in verse 45, Goliath does not realize that by defying the armies of Israel, who is he really defying? The God of the armies of Israel. Of course, he doesn't see it that way. All right, verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. To be dismayed means to be at a complete loss as to what to do. Greatly afraid as well. Now, their fear was based on outward appearances, wasn't it? They saw Goliath as an invincible warrior. How did David see Goliath? See the difference? David was not looking at appearances. But Saul and the armies of Israel were looking at appearances. Remember from last week? When it came time to choose Saul's replacement, Samuel had the sons of Jesse stand before him, and even Samuel thought, wow, this must be the Lord's anointed. And the Lord said, none of these. So here comes David. Samuel said, that's the one, anoint him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. This is beautifully illustrated here in the story of David and Goliath, isn't it? So I want you to notice they were acting, Saul and the armies of Israel were acting just like the first generation of Israelites who were afraid to fight the giants of Canaan. Numbers 13, let's turn there together. I submit to you that the first generation of Israel were afraid of the ancestors of Goliath because he's one of the Anakim. Numbers 13. And I suspect that Goliath was puny, a puny giant compared to the Anakim. Who was it? Was it Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was 13 feet long? So Goliath was one of the smaller giants. Numbers 13, verses 31 and 33. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. Now look at this. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Again, basing everything on outward appearance. Of course, the giants are going to look at you as grasshoppers, but wow, isn't that sad? In our own sight, we were like grasshoppers. So you're looking at outward appearances. All right, back to 1 Samuel 17. So the first generation of Israel, what did they do? They refused to believe that the Lord would keep his promise to give them the land of Canaan. So it was the second generation under Joshua's leadership and command that the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan, including most of the Anakim. But now under Saul, Israel is afraid of one measly old giant. So we can understand now, can't we? We're starting to get a clear picture of the significance and the meaning of David and Goliath. Matthew Henry is the only commentator that I came across who actually raised this question. Where was Jonathan all this while? Here's his answer. While he did not accept the challenge, who in the last war had so bravely engaged a whole army of the Philistines? His question was, why did Jonathan not accept the challenge? Doubtless he did not feel himself stirred up of God to do it, as he did in the former case. The best and bravest men are no more than what God makes them. Jonathan must now sit still because the honor of engaging Goliath is reserved for David. I think that's about as good a comment we can make. The Bible doesn't tell us where Jonathan was or why he did not accept the challenge. All right, next major section. Let's move on, verses 12 through 19. Jesse sends David to the camp to see how his brothers are doing. I want to draw your attention, first of all, to the transition from verse 11 to verse 12. This is important. It's a literary device. What's the last thing we're told? Verse 11, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David, literally in the Hebrew, but David. There's a contrast. So in this corner, introducing Goliath. Now, let's learn about his opponent, David. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. I'm going to pause right there. In Israel, the age requirement for military service was 20 years old. That's in Numbers chapter 1, verses 3 and 20. So David was likely under 20 at this time. But what about the other 4 sons of Jesse? So David was number 8, the youngest. The 3 oldest were following Saul. They're named here. But notice the other 4 sons of Jesse aren't even mentioned. So I'm not sure what to make of that. But all the attention, obviously, is on David and his 3 oldest brothers. Notice how we are this is a literary device. We are reintroduced to David. We were already introduced to David in the last chapter. His family connections were already stated in the previous chapter, but here more details are added. We're given more information about Jesse being old, and we're actually given the names of his 3 oldest brothers. Okay, the next verse, 15. Again, look at the contrast. The 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now, if you weren't here last week, let's turn to the last part of chapter 16, when David was summoned to appear at the royal court to minister his music when Saul was oppressed by the evil spirit. Verse 22 of chapter 16, then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And the previous verse said that David became Saul's armor bearer. So David was enlisted for service in Saul's royal court. But that didn't mean that he stayed there all the time. Go back to verse 15 of 17. David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Notice David's faithfulness to his father. What does this reveal about his character? Was there anything said about Goliath's character? Well, he himself revealed his character by defying the armies of Israel and boasting and so forth. But all the emphasis was on his appearance, how impressive it was. What's the emphasis on David? Look at his faithfulness to his father. Even though he was anointed to be king, he was not ambitious for the throne. He wasn't anxious to stay close to the royal court. Clearly, David is a godly example of being faithful each day with your personal responsibilities. And I would like to pause, because I believe this is a very, very practical application for all of us. So often we're after the big things in life. We want to do great things. We want mountaintop experiences. But look at David. David focused on his daily responsibilities, each day focusing on being faithful. That was actually preparation for this moment. He had no idea that all that he was doing as a faithful son was preparation for this key battle in the history of Israel. All right, questions? Yeah.
Well, I just, when we just read that, it just made me think that the fact is that you said he was faithful to feed his father's sheep. And I thought that is what God asked him to do when he became king.
Yeah. He was already a shepherd of literal sheep, which qualified him to be a shepherd of people. Yeah. God's people. Yeah, exactly. We'll save all of the typology for next week, because we're going to see there's a lot of typology here. David is clearly a type of Christ, par excellence. Okay, look at I'm going to draw your attention now to how the tension is building. Verse 16. Again, this is a literary device. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So Goliath issued his taunting challenge every morning and night for 40 days straight. And still, no one has challenged him. What's the significance of this? Well, the number 40, as you know, is very significant in the Bible. The number 40 refers to a generation in the Bible. It also quite often refers to a time of testing. So the fact that Goliath has done this for 40 days, I'm not going to be dogmatic on this, but the sense is given that since it was for 40 days, and the Bible is drawing our attention to this, the sense is given that he's about to cease issuing this challenge, and then the war is going to commence. So he's not going to just do this indefinitely. So you see how the tension is building? What would have happened if Goliath said, okay, I can see that no one is going to challenge me. What's going to happen next then? The battle begins. Who's going to win the battle? The Philistines are going to win the battle. Saul and the armies of Israel have apostatized. Saul has apostatized from the Lord. They're dismayed and terrified. They're going to be defeated. They're going to be slaughtered by the Philistines. So look how the tension is building here. How is the Lord going to get David in a position to save the day? Look how he does it. Verse 17. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines, fighting in this way. So this is considered to be the battle. Goliath is issuing this challenge. But fighting there, the term, again, carries the idea that they're getting ready to actually engage in battle. See how close they are to fighting. All right. Why did Jesse send David? The thought just occurred to me when I asked where the other brothers were. More than likely, the other brothers were helping Jesse, okay, with the work that was required as part of the household, part of the family estate. But notice again, they're not even mentioned. David, notice again, he is the faithful one. He's the youngest one. Jesse knows he's been anointed. All of his brothers know that he's been anointed. Maybe he was the fastest runner. Okay. That's right. Okay. Notice he said, run to your brothers. So it's a matter of urgency, isn't it? And look at God's providence. Jesse has no idea what's going on. He's a good dad, of course. Yeah, he's training up David in the way he should go. Yeah, excellent. Jesse knows that David is dependable. He's faithful. It sort of reminds me of, I don't know if this is legitimate, sort of reminds me of Jacob sending Joseph, who was the youngest at the time, to go see how his brothers were doing. But we'll save that for another time. What was I going to say? Yeah, look at God's providence. Jesse has no idea that Goliath has been issuing this challenge for 40 days and nights. No idea. So why now? Obviously, God's providence. He's sending David in the nick of time, so to speak, at the 11th hour, if I can use those terms. So I want you also to notice that David did not ask his father if he can go to the battle. In just a little bit, we're going to see that David's brothers are going to accuse him of coming to the battle just out of curiosity. David didn't ask his father if he can go. His father sent him. So little did Jesse know how important his decision was to send David. Just a simple decision, a simple task. Yeah, Keith.
I mean, there's also the fact that there was already an established relationship between David and Saul. So Jesse's already going to know that, well, you've been hanging out with Saul anyway, so he would maybe
Oh, yeah.
be the most reasonable person to send.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a good observation, that David had already established a relationship with Saul. Yeah, good point. And David would know, David would also have some connections, and he's actually given specific instructions, isn't he, to take some of the provisions to, where is it? To the supply keeper and the captain. Yeah, very good. All right, let's move on. Verses 17 through verses 20 and following. So here's the point I want to make before I continue. Goliath's challenge went unaccepted until David visited the battleground to bring food to his brothers. So here we go. In this corner, the mighty champion of the Philistines, Goliath. And in this corner, the faithful shepherd boy, David. Sent on an errand by his father to see how his brothers are doing. All right, verses 20 through 30. So David rose early in the morning. That's a common phrase in the Bible to describe godly character. When Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac, he didn't sleep in, got up early in the morning to do his duty. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper. He's going to make sure his sheep are taken care of. And took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. See how close they are to engagement? For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then, as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. For the first time, David sees and hears Goliath. Verse 24. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Nothing has changed in 40 days. The response is still fear and cowardice. Notice, it says they fled. David shows up. He hears the words for the first time, and he doesn't go anywhere. The armies of Israel have been hearing these same words for 40 days. And they're terrified still. And they fled, it says. So it's even worse for them. Now, look at verse 25. Look how eager the soldiers are to justify their cowardice. So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. There's a bit of irony here, isn't there? Saul would not risk his life to fight Goliath, but he was willing to richly reward anyone who would do so on his behalf. But no one was brave enough, no matter what the incentive was. So look at the complete and utter failure of King Saul. He has failed in his calling to be Israel's champion, the one to fight the Lord's battles. And his leadership has not inspired a single soldier to defend the cause of his king, his nation, and by implication, his God. All right, verse 26. These are the first recorded words of David. And look how significant they are, verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's first recorded words. All right. Do you see what David said there? The armies of Israel are what? The armies of the living God. Do the Philistines have a living God? No, they have an idol. Dagon and Ashtoreth, yeah, the two primary gods of the Philistines. Israel's armies are the armies of the living God, and what else is the living God called? The Lord of hosts. Now, we'll come back to that phrase, because David's going to use that phrase in his actual confrontation with Goliath. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. The term hosts refers to, it's a military term, refers to a large number of soldiers, if you will. And this is a reference to the heavenly armies of the Lord. Thousands upon thousands, 10,000 times 10,000 of the heavenly armies. Okay, we'll come back to that phrase later on. And do you remember the pre-incarnate Son of God appeared to Joshua? Remember that encounter, referring to himself as the commander of the army of the Lord? The Lord of hosts is the Almighty King of all creation and all of history, has all of the resources at his disposal of the universe. Okay, David was outraged that Israel's king could think of no higher incentive for his soldiers than the material riches that he offered. And so this is a bit of sarcasm. What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach, the disgrace from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Okay, notice with me, David is the first to bring a theological perspective to the situation. He's not judging the situation based upon appearances, but rather he sees the situation with what? The eyes of faith in the Lord and in his word. David was walking by faith, not by sight. It comes naturally for us to look at outward appearances. Remember, even Samuel, yes, the prophet Samuel was not perfect. David was not perfect. But by God's grace on this occasion, he looked by faith at the insults of Goliath. And he saw them for what they were, an uncircumcised pagan mocking the one true God and his people, from whom the Messiah will come. So this is holy outrage. This is a disgrace in David's eyes. He knew the truth. The Israelites were engaged in a holy war against the Philistines. And the Bible says the Lord fights for those who trust him when they are confronting his enemies. We could give several examples of that, which we won't at this time. So do you see David's outrage? You are allowing Goliath. You're allowing Goliath to treat the living God as a mere idol. How can you allow the blasphemy? Okay, let's keep reading. Verse 27, and the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. All right, here's a confrontation between David and his brothers. Verse 28 through 30. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Typical older brother, huh? Don't forget, Eliab is the oldest. And the oldest did have a privileged position in Israel, didn't they? But on this occasion, Eliab was bypassed. He was there when his youngest brother was anointed right in front of him. And his attitude is basically, what are you doing here? And who's doing your job while you're gone? I want you to notice the sarcasm. Look what he says. With whom have you left those few sheep? What's the implication? You just got a few sheep to take care of. You should be back there taking care of your sheep. That's what you're good at. You don't belong in the battlefield. You're just showing off. All this talk about shutting Goliath up. You can't defeat Goliath. I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. Ironically, Eliab was guilty of pride. Anytime we claim to know what's in somebody's heart, we're walking in pride. No one knows the heart except the Lord. I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. For you have come down to see the battle, which wasn't true. David didn't ask to see the battle. He was sent by his father. In fact, Father Jesse had sent David to check on Eliab and the others who were there to see how they were doing, to see if there's anything he could do for them. Okay, look at David's response. So he was reviled, and David did not revile in return. And I wish I can say that every time I was reviled, I didn't revile in return. And I've had many occasions where I've had to ask the Lord to forgive me. But look at David's response. Verse 29, and David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? So notice his modest and humble response. What was wrong with me? What was wrong with what I said? So are you beginning to see now why Eliab is angry? Sometimes we're angry when somebody else stands up because it makes us look bad. David is basically saying, why hasn't anyone shut Goliath up? It's been going on for 40 days and 40 nights. By implication, why haven't you, Eliab? How can you allow this to continue? So Eliab was obviously envious of David, wasn't he? So he was envious of David's courage. He knew it was a rebuke to everybody there that day. So it's easier for Eliab to criticize his brother than to repent of his own lack of courage. Excuse me. I'm losing my voice. Just in time. All right. Let's finish this up. Then he that would be David turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. Why does David keep asking that question? What reward is there going to be for killing the Philistine? It's almost like he can't believe the answer. In a way, David is saying you don't need an incentive. This is incentive enough. And so he's not going to allow anyone to get in the way of him standing up for the Lord. Notice how God has prepared David for this moment. God is the one that's orchestrated this. And next week when we continue, we'll begin to look at the application. How does this apply to our lives today? Because if we're honest, we would love to be, wouldn't we want to be in a situation like this where God could orchestrate a situation where we could actually clearly stand for him and make a difference and see the end result being victory and glorification for the Lord. But let's not forget, David was far from perfect. David didn't always do this, did he? Tragically, there's times where he failed big time, as we'll see later on. But on this occasion, by God's grace and providence, he's going to be victorious. He's going to do the right thing, and he has to stand alone. So look at the application, and then we'll close. This is from Richard Phillips's commentary. We should apply this passage by asking what appearances have the tendency to daunt us and undo our faith. Do we act as if we know and serve a God who is greater than every other power, a Savior who is willing and able to save us from all dangers? Behind Goliath was the same devil who wages spiritual warfare today. The issue is always the same. Do you really trust in a loving God of power and grace? David didn't always. He did on this occasion. Second application. Not only will men in general be displeased, but even the people of God, when in a low state, will neither understand nor value the actings of faith. The man of God must be prepared to be misinterpreted and to stand alone. So on this occasion, David, the man of God, was misinterpreted. Look at the opposition that David faced. Look at the obstacles that were in his path. But he wasn't going to let anybody, not even his family, stand in his way. He had to stand alone on this particular occasion. And there's significance to that as well. All right. I will stop, but are there any questions?